Everyone's heard the official story. Billy the Kid died in Fort Sumner in 1881, and that was the end of it. But in 1949, an old cowboy named Jim McDaniels signed a sworn affidavit saying he met Billy years later, alive, older, and living under the name Brushy Bill Roberts. So what do you trust more? 2 shots in a dark room, or a witness who put his name on the line nearly 70 years later? Number 1. Fort Sumner after midnight. July 14th, 1881, Fort Sumner, New Mexico Territory, and the whole story people think they know about Billy the Kid comes down to a few tense minutes in near darkness. Sheriff Pat Garrett had been tracking him for months. Billy was already a legend in the Old West, not because he was some comic book supervillain, but because he kept slipping through the fingers of lawmen who were supposed to be the final word on frontier justice. That night, Garrett ended up inside the home of Pete Maxwell, one of Billy's associates. Accounts vary on the exact setup, but the basic idea is the same. Garrett is inside, it's late, lighting is bad, and the place is quiet in that way desert nights get when everyone's trying not to make a sound. Then a young man walks in. He speaks in Spanish. Most versions say he asked something like, "Who is it?" because Spanish was normal in that part of the world. Garrett fires. The official story says he hit Billy the Kid, and the most wanted outlaw of the Lincoln County War era died right there at 21. A coroner's jury signs off on it. The body is buried quickly, and the next thing you know, the Billy the Kid chapter of Wild West history is supposedly closed. Except history almost never stays closed. Not in the American Old West, where names changed fast, paperwork was messy, and people got famous in a hurry. When you dig into what actually happened after the shots, the timeline starts to feel a little too neat. The identification wasn't like modern ID where someone checks fingerprints or photos on a screen. It was basically, people said it was him, a jury agreed, and that was that. And if you're already the most famous Old West outlaw in the territory, that kind of quick certainty is exactly what you'd want if you were trying to disappear. That's where the survival theory sneaks in. Not as a fantasy about an outlaw living forever, but as a simple question. In a dark room, in a rush, with everyone stressed and half the town running on rumor, is it possible they buried the wrong man? Number 2, the cracks in the official version. People hear official story and assume it means airtight proof, like a video recording or a lab report. In the Old West, official often just meant the story the authorities agreed to stick with. Pat Garrett's version became the backbone. He recognized Billy, he shot him, and that was justice. Garrett later wrote about Billy too, which helped lock the narrative in place. But even in the 1880s, there were whispers that things didn't add up perfectly. For one thing, the killing happened in low light. If you've ever tried to recognize someone you know in a dark hallway at night, you know how shaky that can be, even without adrenaline pumping. Then there's the speed of the burial. The body was put in the ground fast, and in that era that wasn't unheard of, especially in hot weather and remote places. Still, quick burials leave less room for careful confirmation. There wasn't a family member flying in from somewhere to check a body. Billy the Kid didn't exactly have a clean, official, easy-to-contact family network ready to verify anything. Another issue people raise is how much pressure there was to close the case. Garrett needed results. The territory wanted Billy gone. And when a famous outlaw dies, a lot of people benefit from the story being simple. The lawman wins, the outlaw loses. Order is restored, end of discussion. There are also old claims reported later, argued over endlessly, that some deputies around Garrett were uneasy about the identification. You'll sometimes hear lines attributed to men like Deputy John Poe, along the lines of, "You shot the wrong man." Whether that exact quote is reliable is debated, but the fact that the doubt exists is the point. The Old West ran on certainty in public and uncertainty behind closed doors. Add in another reality. Bodies and graves in that region didn't always stay exactly where people thought they were. Cemeteries got flooded, markers got replaced, stories shifted. So when modern people say, "Why not just dig up the body and settle it?" even that runs into a problem. How sure are you you're testing the right remains? In a world of outlaws, cowboys, lawmen, and towns that changed overnight, the cracks aren't proof of a cover-up, but they are enough to keep the door open. If the wrong man died in that room, the rest of history would look official, simply because everyone kept repeating it. Number 3. A lawyer starts pulling on the thread. Fast forward almost 70 years. If you want to understand why the Billy the Kid survived theory didn't die out, the key isn't just rumor, it's paperwork. In the late 1940s, a Texas lawyer named William Morrison starts looking for living witnesses, people who weren't just fans of Wild West legends, but people who claimed they had actually known Billy. That's a totally different kind of claim. It's one thing to say, "My grandpa heard a story." It's another to say, "I stood in the same room with him, and I can still recognize him." Morrison gets drawn in because he hears a story that sounds wild, even by Old West standards. An elderly man says Billy the Kid didn't die in 1881 at all. Instead, he survived, went underground, and lived in Texas under another name. The name that keeps popping up is Brushy Bill Roberts, an old man living in or near Hyco, Texas. The story Morrison hears doesn't come from a random teenager looking for attention. It comes from a man named Joe Hines, who claims he personally knows the truth and that the real Billy has been hiding in plain sight. In some versions of this saga, Hines even claims he's actually Jesse Evans, the leader of a gang connected to the Lincoln County War era. That detail alone makes historians roll their eyes, because the real Jesse Evans has his own documented history and timeline, and the Old West wasn't a place where people lived quietly to 90 without anyone noticing. Still, Morrison isn't just collecting campfire stories. He wants sworn statements, names, dates, scars, photographs, anything that looks like evidence instead of vibes. And this is where the whole case takes a turn from legend to legal style claim. Morrison doesn't just want to believe. He wants people to sign their names to what they're saying. That matters because once you put something in writing under oath, you're no longer just telling a tall tale at a bar. You're making a claim that can follow you. Morrison's hunt leads to a face-to-face meeting that becomes the centerpiece of the survival argument. Old witnesses from the outlaw and lawman era meeting an old man who says he's Billy the Kid. Number 4. Brushy Bill's story and why it hooks people. When Morrison finally gets close to Brushy Bill Roberts, the pitch is basically this. Billy the Kid escaped the 1881 death scene because Pat Garrett shot the wrong man. In the Brushy Bill version, the man who died wasn't Billy at all, but someone else, often named as Billy Barlow in the retelling, while the real Billy slipped away and spent the rest of his life avoiding attention. If you're thinking, why would anyone buy that? Here's why it works on people. First, it fits the setting. The American Old West was full of mistaken identities, switched names, and half-documented lives. Second, Billy already had a reputation for slipping out of trouble. He escaped jail before. He dodged posses. He moved between communities where English and Spanish mixed and where a lot of people didn't keep neat records. Third, Brushy Bill didn't just tell one vague story and call it a day. He reportedly told detailed accounts of the Lincoln County War, people he claimed to know, locations, and moments that weren't always the headline versions you'd find in a simple newspaper summary. He also reportedly had scars, lots of them, and supporters said the placement lined up with old stories about wounds Billy had taken. That kind of physical detail is persuasive in a way that pure storytelling isn't. On top of that, there were behavioral claims, like being able to slip out of handcuffs the way Billy was rumored to do, and knowing personal details about escapes and gunfights that a casual fan wouldn't know. The problem is, a skilled fraud could also learn a lot. By the late 1940s, Billy the Kid wasn't some obscure outlaw. He was a full-blown Wild West celebrity. Books existed. Old newspaper clippings existed. People had been talking about him for decades. So the question becomes, is Brushy Bill a real survivor, or a man who built a convincing identity out of public stories and private confidence? Morrison tries to answer that by doing something smart. He brings in people who claim they knew Billy personally, because those are the hardest people to fool. If your whole act is based on reading headlines, the moment you face someone who was actually there, your story can fall apart fast, Number 5. Jim McDaniels and the Affidavit moment. This is where the witness angle gets serious. One of the names Morrison finds is Jim McDaniels, an elderly cowboy by 1949, living quietly in Texas, but claiming a past that puts him close to the violent heart of the Lincoln County War era. In the story that circulated for years, McDaniels wasn't just a bystander. He claimed he rode with the Jesse Evans gang during that time, which would have put him in the orbit of the same outlaw network Billy moved around. The Jesse Evans gang, the lawmen versus outlaws chaos, the range wars, the cattle disputes. It was a messy world where people crossed lines, switched sides, and survived mostly by being careful and lucky. If McDaniels really lived that life, then he wasn't the type to be impressed by a legend title. He would have known the difference between a story and a real face. Morrison sets up the meeting. McDaniels comes face to face with Brushy Bill Roberts. And according to the survival camp, this wasn't some quick handshake and a photo for the papers. McDaniels studied him. He asked questions. The idea was to test whether Brushy Bill knew things an outsider wouldn't know. Not the stuff you'd read in a dramatic retelling, but the small, specific, you had to be there details. Who was standing where? What happened at a certain place? What someone said? How a situation felt before it went sideways? After that meeting, McDaniels signs a sworn affidavit stating he believes Brushy Bill Roberts is Billy the Kid Henry McCarty, William H. Bonney, the same young outlaw he said he'd known decades earlier. And that's the heart of the claim. Not someone said it once. Not a rumor. A sworn statement, basically a legal document where you put your name down and say, "This is what I'm willing to stand by." For people who want to believe Billy survived, McDaniels becomes the strongest kind of support, a living link to the Old West who put it in writing. If he's right, then Pat Garrett either made a fatal mistake or covered something up. If he's wrong, then you're watching the power of memory, myth, and suggestion play out in real time. Number 6. 4 signatures, 70 years, and the problem of memory. McDaniels wasn't the only one. The Brushy Bill story also includes other affidavits signed around the same period by men who claimed they knew Billy personally. Names that show up in retellings include Severo Gallegos, Jose Montoya, and Martile Abul. Depending on which archive or museum summary you're reading, the spelling can vary, but the core claim is consistent. Multiple aging witnesses met Brushy Bill and backed him as Billy the Kid. 2 more men, in some versions, reportedly wouldn't sign, but also didn't immediately call it nonsense. On paper, that sounds heavy. 4 old-timers from the Old West era pointing at a man and saying, "That's him." But there's a catch that doesn't go away no matter how much you like the mystery. Human memory is weird. People don't store a perfect video of a face and pull it up 70 years later like a file. Memory is more like a story you keep retelling, and every retell can change the shape a little. Add in age, fading eyesight, and the fact that Billy the Kid died young, meaning nobody had an old Billy reference in their head, and it gets harder. You're not comparing a 21-year-old outlaw to another 21-year-old. You're comparing a young face from the 1870s to an elderly man in the 1940s. That's a completely different task. And if the people meeting Brushy Bill already wanted the story to be true, or if they were surrounded by others who wanted it to be true, that pressure can do work in the background. It's not always intentional lying. Sometimes it's the brain trying to make a puzzle piece fit because the idea is exciting and the details seem close enough. There's also the social factor. When someone like Morrison shows up, serious and persistent, treating you like an important witness to history, it can shape how you see your own memories. You might start thinking, "I did know him. I should be sure." Still, you can't just dismiss 4 affidavits like they're nothing. In an era before DNA tests and clean record keeping, eyewitness testimony was often the best tool available. That's why this case stays alive. Because it's not only built on vibes, it's built on sworn statements, flawed as memory can be, that directly challenge the standard history book ending. Number 7, the paper trail fights back. The strongest pushback against the Brushy Bill claim doesn't come from people who just don't like conspiracies. It comes from documents that suggest Brushy Bill Roberts couldn't possibly be Billy based on age and timeline. Some records and family accounts place Roberts' birth much later than Billy the Kid's likely birth year. Billy is generally placed around 1859, while Brushy Bill is sometimes claimed by records to be born closer to 1879. If that later date is correct, the whole thing collapses immediately, because you can't be a teenager in the Lincoln County war years and also be born after they happened. Supporters of Brushy Bill argue the records are wrong, or that he intentionally altered his details to protect himself. And to be fair, in the Old West, wrong records weren't rare. People changed names. Census takers wrote down what they heard. Birth certificates weren't always a thing, especially for poor families and people moving constantly. But skeptics point out something important. If you're trying to prove you're Billy the Kid, you can't just wave away every inconvenient document. Another problem raised is literacy. Billy the Kid, by many accounts, could read and write at least somewhat. Brushy Bill's supporters and critics argue about whether he could. If he struggled with basic writing, that's another mismatch. Then there's the inside knowledge issue. Billy's story had been told and retold for decades by the time Brushy Bill was making his claim. It's possible to memorize a surprising amount, especially if you've been living with the identity for years. And the more famous a person is, the easier it becomes to build a believable story around them because there's so much material to work with. On the other side, the Garrett camp has its own weaknesses too. Pat Garrett's personal credibility has been debated by historians for a long time, not necessarily because he was lying about everything, but because he had motives. He had a public image to protect, and he lived in a time when shaping your own legend was part of surviving politically. Garrett's "I recognized him by voice" element is also a tricky detail to lean on. Recognizing a voice in the dark is possible. It's also something people confidently believe they can do, until they're proven wrong. And once the official version got locked in, everything that followed, burial, public story, printed accounts, would naturally align with it, because the system had no reason to reopen the case. So you end up with two imperfect forces colliding: late life affidavits and early life official paperwork. Neither side is a clean knockout. Number 8. Pardon attempts, modern tech, and why the legend stays messy. One reason this mystery refuses to die is that people have tried, again and again, to get a final answer using modern methods, and it keeps getting stuck in real-world complications. DNA sounds like the obvious solution, but it requires confirmed remains. With Billy the Kid, even the burial details are debated over time, partly because cemeteries changed and markers moved. When the foundation is uncertain, just test it turns into a legal and logistical nightmare. On top of that, the Brushy Bill story doesn't end in a neat courtroom verdict either. Morrison pushed for a pardon, because if Brushy Bill really was Billy, then a pardon would be the official stamp that forces history to take the claim seriously. In 1950, New Mexico's governor at the time, Thomas J. Mabry, rejected the pardon request, and Brushy Bill died soon after, taking whatever he knew with him. Years later, other officials and researchers revisited the idea in different forms, sometimes more as a historical curiosity than a real legal process. People also leaned on photo analysis and early facial comparison techniques. Supporters love to mention computer-style comparisons, claiming a strong match between known images of Billy and pictures of Brushy Bill, while critics respond that these tools can be suggestive but not definitive, especially when the photo quality is poor and the subject's age is totally different. What keeps pulling people back is the same simple tension. The official story depends on a fast identification under bad conditions, and the alternative story depends on human memory stretched across 7 decades. If you're the type who trusts lawmen and official records, Pat Garrett's version sounds like the hard truth of the Old West. If you're the type who knows how often institutions protect their own stories, the idea of a mistake or a quiet cover-up doesn't sound impossible at all. And then there's the emotional side of it. Billy the Kid isn't just a criminal in the record books. He's a symbol of the Wild West, the young outlaw who moved between violence and charm in the way legends do. People want the story to have one more twist, one more escape, one more dusty road leading out of Fort Sumner. That's why a single affidavit signed by an old cowboy like Jim McDaniels carries so much weight in the imagination. It's a plain document with a signature, but it points straight at the possibility that the history book ending was wrong. And as long as that piece of paper exists in museum files, as long as people can stand there and read a witness saying, "I looked at him and I knew," the question keeps coming back in the most annoying, persistent way. If the kid really died in 1881, why does this sworn statement feel so stubbornly hard to erase?